Hello and welcome to Nature Knowledge. This is a speaker series with experts sharing scientific knowledge on current issues affecting nature in Florida. I'm your host, Dr. Shelly Johnson, State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources with University of Florida IFAS Extension. Thanks for joining us today. Today, I'm really excited to have this topic. I think this is also a very relevant and timely topic. We're going to be talking about large invasive reptiles in Florida, and I'm happy to have our speaker here today is Paul Evans. He's the outreach coordinator with the Croc Docs, which is a group of researchers and scientists that work down at the Fort Lauderdale Research and Education Center with IFAS Extension. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paul. Welcome, Paul. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that you can share your screen.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Shelly said, my name is Paul Evans. I am the science writer and outreach coordinator for the University of Florida's Croc Docs Research Lab, research team down here in Fort Lauderdale area. And today we are going to be talking about non-native large reptiles here in Florida. So who are we? Croc Docs, as I said, is who I work for. It is my team down here, and we are a team of biologists, researchers, land managers, and outreach specialists working in tandem with a lot of projects dealing with non-native reptiles. Specifically, we do a lot of work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, as well as South Florida Water Management District. And then obviously we work for IFAS Extension. So kind of an overview on things we're going to touch on today with the subject of invasive and non-native reptiles in Florida. We're going to go into what's the problem here, why do we care, a little bit into the details of these animals in general, specifically animals of importance that tend to be the large constrictors that are causing a large problem here in the state. Go over a brief review of what type of management's being done, what and why citizen scientists could be so important, and how you guys could potentially help better the war, if you will, against these non-native reptiles. Brief identification as well as reporting overview if you want to do some help in reporting and helping us identify some of these animals just in your daily life. So answer to that question that was asked at the beginning. And the answer to really the thesis of this, of what's the problem? Why are all these non-native reptiles such a problem? And non-native amphibians as well. Both of them are here in very large quantities. So the correct answer to how many are introduced is technically 185. Now, this is as of 2015. I believe the records census study do push it a little bit closer to 200. Now, introductions does not mean that all of those animals are actively in this environment, in the swamps, in the farmlands, in the estuary systems around here. But it does mean that at one point in that 5-year period, we did get more introductions. The real problem, which I saw a couple of you put this, I believe as your answer was around 63, 64, 65, that range. Those are the ones that are established. So these are introductions that became successful, which means they started breeding, they started thriving, and they started ecologically having a real impact to some of these habitats. So why Florida? Why is Florida such a great place for all these animals to come? We would love to say it's because we have Disney, University of Florida, and all these beautiful beaches here, but it's not. It's because we have a really nice climate that happens to coincide with how a bunch of these Southeast Asian, some of these Australian, African, all these tropical areas, and of course, South American species, where they live. It's very close to their climates, their humidity that they're used to. as well as we have so many port cities here in Florida where a lot of ornamental plants and exotic pet trade happens. And whether it's accidental or unfortunately purposeful, that's where a lot of these accidental and purposeful releases have occurred. Is something at one point, whether it's in the 1800s or whether it was 2 months ago, happened to sneak out of a box and just came here and started doing, unfortunately, very, very well in these swamplands, as well as we get a lot of hurricanes. So sometimes there are research facilities, there are breeding facilities, whether it's for the pet trade or perhaps some genetic studies, where a lot of these animals are being housed. And unfortunately, with hurricanes, they are very, very powerful and have been known to knock down some buildings and cause some mayhem. And that's where a lot of initial releases of some of these larger reptiles is believed to be linked to back in the 1990s. So reptiles here in Florida. Florida actually has more non-native reptiles and amphibians than anywhere else in the world. So that's a big problem, as we'll get to a bit later, because the way a lot of reptiles and amphibians that are native species here in Florida function is very different than how many of these non-native and exotic species adapted. They adapted fundamentally to live in a different environment with different players at the board. And here they're going to be functioning very differently because Florida has many different native animals that don't play the same game. So a lot of the species of non-native lizards in Florida actually are breeding in larger numbers than Florida species. So more non-native species that were not from Florida originally are actually actively reproducing. And that has put a lot of pressure on the Florida native lizards, and many of them are starting to decline in some areas in their populations. The largest snake in Florida that's actively breeding and being successful is the Burmese python. And I actually believe the next two largest snake species breeding and reproducing here in Florida are also invasive, which is a big problem because it means a lot of our other native species are not able to really outcompete these animals and they just kind of flourish. This graph here is called an invasion curve. It's a trend we tend to see with some invasive species once they are introduced. So when they get to that point of introduction, which is right there at the beginning of the graph, you start to see that over time, it's going to become a lot more expensive for us to manage the species, as well as the areas and the species distribution that is able to occur increases as their population increases, which then causes a big problem because usually the path to eradication, it needs to happen pretty quickly. And usually it happens, or usually the trend shows that in order for us to really eradicate them, we need a lot more public awareness earlier on, where unfortunately a lot of public awareness tends to come to kind of a popularity point where it's already a problem. You can't really get rid of all of them from a safe point. And that's where we start using management styles like containment, where it's keeping this animal to a certain area. So you hope over the course of 10 or 20 years to fully eliminate that species, which is hard because a lot of these animals have adaptations both physically and just behaviorally that make them very hard to remove successfully. So invasive species, non-native species. I've used both terms throughout this program so far. So we're gonna break those down real quick. Invasive species are going to be species here in South Florida that are really, really harmful to human health, biological health, or environmental health. So this could mean that they're not from here, but they are putting a lot of pressure on native gecko species, or they are putting a lot of pressure on native mammals. They are causing harm in some form or fashion. A non-native species is a species here in Florida that is not from here, but is not actually putting any known economical and biological, ecological pressure or harm on any of the species or any of the environments here in Florida. But the invasive species tend to what we find more of a problem here because a lot of these animals are going to be a threat to a lot of our native species. Many of them tend to be larger, which allows them to outcompete a lot of our native species, as well as allows them to actually predate their native counterparts, which then becomes a problem because not only are they able to outcompete the native gecko species, they're also eating the native gecko species or the native anole species, which becomes an even harder problem to try to solve. They bring new diseases, new parasites, as well as they just become this giant obstacle when we are trying to finally get more restoration going for the Everglades. And over time, they're just going to become more and more expensive to manage because we're adding, as you saw, just so many introductions every year. You're just getting higher and higher chances of more of these animals to start breeding and becoming a bigger problem. So why do we care? Invasive species, for the most part, as I said, is going to come from what they are eating. That's where a lot of the problems are coming. If you look at this beautiful infographic here, this is an estimate of what a Burmese python would need to eat over the course of 5 to 7 years to become around 13 feet, which is roughly the size of a pretty average adult size. They obviously can get a lot bigger, but that's a pretty average size. This is a big problem because there's a lot of mammals, there's a lot of other types of endangered, threatened, vulnerable species that they're eating here, as well as this is a lot of resources they're taking away from some of our native species that is going to struggle. And we've seen this struggle pop up in many of our native populations. This can be a problem for people who have pets that you keep outdoors, as well as, like I said, it's just a big imbalance. You're causing a very large variable to be added to an equation that didn't have a large snake, a large land terrestrial lizard as, you know, one of its apex predators. It had gators, it had crocodiles. It didn't necessarily, you know, need an 18-foot semi-aquatic snake. And then we run into economic problems because obviously it's going to cost a lot to really manage some of these species. Additionally, a lot of tourism thrives in this part of the world with airboats and tours and nature centers showing the beauty that has existed here in Florida. Florida truly does have a very unique type of wildlife that you can't find anywhere else. It really is absolutely gorgeous, but that becomes a problem as that starts to diminish. That tourism field starts to crash and burn, and then we're once again having more economic problems led to these introduced species, which is why they can be linked to be called invasive. So pythons and other large constrictors, as you can see, they're very, very large. 15 to 17 foot is where they really become a huge problem because they're able to take out some of these larger alligators and potentially other species. Some of the species of concern that have been found in both large reptiles, whether it be lizards or snakes, has been wood stork, key largo wood rat, and the Cape sable seaside sparrow. Specifically, those first two are ones that through diet analysis have actually been linked back to predation from large non-native reptiles. And then we do believe that it is likely Florida panther and American crocodiles have had impact, whether it be some type of resource pressure and being outcompeted for different territories, or whether it has been through direct predation, though evidence for direct predation has not been linked yet. And obviously, a lot of those species are important because they tend to be more vulnerable here in Florida. So the population estimates for a lot of these species, especially ones like the Burmese python that have had more of a South Florida widespread, it's very hard to know how many are even here. It's hard because a lot of the places they're living are going to be pretty inaccessible, and that makes it very hard for eradication to happen. So then we're kind of stuck here trying to figure out, okay, what can we do in terms of containment? And a lot of this comes from surveys and trying to start to figure out what regions of the world, specifically here in Florida, they are living in. And this is hard because they have a very low detectability. If you look in this photo down here with the beautiful pond leaves, there are two in there nestled together. And you can see how their natural adaptation for camouflage really does allow them to just blend in really, really well, which is why a lot of times we're going to find them on levees and roads. Some of the management styles that are happening that are going to allow us to get a lot more work done is eDNA. This is environmental DNA. This is usually used to detect the presence of rare or cryptic species, but here in Florida, we use that to take Burmese python DNA or Nile monitor DNA and stick it in different waterway sources to see if those are ways of species distribution. There are detector dogs. So these are essentially using a dog like you would a drug dog or a security dog to search for the scent of Burmese python, a Spinytail iguana, and find them in these areas of Florida to better survey certain landscapes that would be much, much harder for humans to do using our resources. Scout snake projects or different telemetry projects, whether it's with tegus or pythons, kind of are used to start finding where they're breeding and going and removing them during those times of the year to try to stop the slow of initial species introductions through reproduction. And then large reptile traps. So that's like this up top picture, kind of just removing what we can and starting to look for ways of distribution. But the point of this, as you can see, this is stuff not just done at Croc Docs, this is stuff done in all different parts of Florida. It really is helpful. It's all hands on deck. The more eyes we can get out there, the better. One of the major useful tools in the last couple of years has been Python contracts. And this has been really helpful. They've removed over 6,000 pythons so far, and I believe this is records only up to 2019. This has been done through the FWC, so Florida Wildlife Commission, and then South Florida Water Management District. Both of them have python/invasive constrictors, because as you will see in a second, there are quite a few constrictor species we are dealing with here. And this has been helpful because pythons tend to have a really low detection probability. It tends to be less than 0.5, which means they're very, very hard to find, typically without them just coming out onto levees and roads. So being able to remove this many in the last couple of years is hopefully going to be a real bright side for us moving forward with this management style. So how can you guys help? Obviously, probably not everyone's dying to be out in the swamp and removing a 17-foot snake, or going through other parts of estuaries or levees and removing really large lizards, or helping at least identify where some of these are. But you are outside, you are living in parts of the world and parts of Florida that we're not living in. You know, you have potentially a really nice backyard. I don't know you, I'm not going to come to your backyard, but you'd be able to go to your backyard and fill in gaps for a whole variety of invasive species. And this could allow a lot of land managers, researchers, not just in this part of the state, but in all different parts of the state, to start getting more of a rapid response to invasive species, slowing the course of introductions and hopefully starting to fight back a lot of these species that have established. More eyes we can get on the ground is just going to be helpful, because us as researchers, as managers, we can't be everywhere at once, which is why we need a lot of help from everyone in the state. So what should you look for? Most of the time you can find animals like this near waterways, whether it's off of roads, levees, in really muddy areas. For a lot of these species, whether it's snake or reptile, you're going to see some tail drags, which will be nice to identify, as well as you'll know for a lot of them that it's not native because it's going to be large. A lot of these animals, they're much, much larger than some of our natives, which allows you to pretty easily identify them. Where should you look? You can find them on boats, garages, really, really busy roads. I think I saw in a news article a couple of months ago that they found one in a grocery store. So, you know, keep your eyes out. They're out there. They tend to be near different water sources, as a lot of these animals, one of the reasons they thrive here in Florida is because we do have a lot of fresh and saltwater resources that are really helpful for them, as well as areas where there's going to be a lot of prey, whether that be small mammals or perhaps some ground nesting bird sites. Those will be pretty prominent for a lot of these non-native reptiles. What should you look for? Usually times of day could be day or night. Best time for seeing especially really large reptiles, it's gonna be early mornings when they're starting to warm up. In cooler months, you may see them in shallow water or canals or wetland puddles. And that's just because they're going to be easier to warm up their body and control it during those cooler months using those water resources. And then when it gets super, super hot and it's raining season here, which I understand can be most of the year, you can find them on unpaved levees, roads, and kind of those really easy areas to spot them. So how to identify large non-native constrictors and other large non-native reptiles? The hint here is, again, they're large. A lot of these animals will be somewhere from 2 to possibly 3 times the size of a lot of our native species. On average, 6 to 10 feet is where a lot of these guys are going to be for constrictors. And then for reptiles, it's going to be around 3 to 4 feet in length. Sorry, not for reptiles. For lizards, they'll be around 3 to 4 feet in length. But some of these guys, especially the constrictors, can be over 20 feet, which is not something naturally you will find with any of our species of Florida snakes. The Burmese python, it's kind of the poster child, unfortunately, here in Florida. It has a pretty heavy grip on a lot of different environments. They have been linked to being here since around the 1990s. They're around 18 feet, can weigh up to 150 pounds. A key identification note is that they do have an arrow-shaped wedge on top of their head. They tend to have this giraffe-like puzzle pattern. And if you were to see it kind of moving through at night and you're just maybe walking your dog, you had a flashlight, they're going to have a nice glossy appearance when hit with light. This is where we've had reports come in. Again, a lot of them tend to kind of be on pretty straight angles, and that's going to be because it's levees, it's roads, that's where a lot of people are seeing them. But as you can see, of the over 12,000 that have actually been reported in the southeast region of Florida, the southeast region of the United States, you see some of those are up there in Georgia as well. Only about half of them were actually verified and removed, which means there are still quite a few more that are obviously out there. And this is something that you guys will be able to report and give more information to help other people in the state continue to try to make Florida very wild, but with the wildlife that's supposed to be here. North African pythons, they are also invasive, which again means they are not great in the environment, whether biologically or economically, in some way or another, as well as it means they are breeding. These guys have a similar pattern to the Burmese python, but they're going to have almost more of a watercolor effect to those puzzle piece patterns. They're not going to have concrete lines in between them that show different blotches. They're going to kind of run together. They will be only about 12 feet max, and they're going to have more of a grayish hue than the browns that you find with a Burmese python. As well as behaviorally, these guys, when they get defensive, they will actually roll their tail up like a Cinnabon and shake it, which is something that could help you if you're trying to understand what a species was. They tend to live in just this one part of the state close to Miami. So there is hope for containment and eventual eradication in the next few years with this species, as long as they are able to be contained in this region. Common boa constrictor, they will be around 9 feet. They have a nice tan oval kind of pattern that goes down to kind of this reddish brown saddle around the tail. They have just a line going down their head, unlike the big wedges found in the other pythons. And then these guys, actually, if you were to hit them with a flashlight, unlike the other two that are larger constrictors, and they're going to have more of a glossy figure, these ones are going to look kind of soft or fuzzy if you were to hit it with a light. So these guys have popped up in a couple more areas of the state, but I've only had breeding records in this region down here in Miami-Dade. There is hope for potential containment and then eradication one day. But the problem with this animal is that they're very, very popular in the pet trade, which is why a trend you're going to start seeing as we go through a couple of these maps is that they do tend to pop up in and around major cities. Ball python is a big player in the pet trade. They tend to have lighter round blotches, but the color is really hard with these guys because they're very popular in the pet trade. They can be orange, white, pink, teal. They can be whole lot of different coloration, but the important stuff to kind of note when identifying them is that they're going to have two different color bands going through the top and then right below their eyes, which may be a different color, but that is a unique band trait to this type of python, as well as they should only be about 2 to 4 feet. So this will be the smallest non-native snake we're going to talk about today. As you can see, they pop up in near or in around a lot of major cities because they are so popular in the pet trade. Dermarill's boa, this is one of the snakes that's starting to pop up more so in the pet trade. They are not established. So what that means is they're not breeding. So this is one of those 185 species that has been introduced at one point, but they've not reached the point of breeding. So they will be around 3 to 6 feet, which is why they tend to be pretty popular in the pet trade, because it's a little bit bigger than a ball python, but you're not quite getting to the massive size of an anaconda, of a Burmese python. But they do occasionally get close to 9 or 10 feet. They have kind of a squiggle pattern saddle on the back that will tend to be light or dark brown. And then they get a little bit more of that saddle pattern down towards their tail like other boas. And then these guys, again, will kind of look more fuzzy if you were to be at night and notice it in a tree with a flashlight. Yellow anaconda, these guys kind of have the most similar pattern to a Burmese python in terms of first glance. But the way fundamentally their jawbones and the kind of neck region, if you will, functions, it's very different. It's kind of like a noodle. It just goes straight. It's the same thickness all the way down. While on a Burmese python and other types of pythons, you're going to have a pretty high definition between the back of the jawbone to the start of the neck and the rest of the body. These guys are not established. They are not breeding, but they have been introduced in some parts and have some records going back a couple years. They're around 6 to 9 feet. They tend to be a yellowish gold color, but that can change and they can be a bit darker based on genetics. They will have a 4 or 5 line pattern going down their head and then immediately moving into the spotted pattern that happens with them. And then they will have more of that glossy appearance like other large constrictors. Green anaconda, they're going to be really, really big, or they're going to be really small. The small ones tend to be subadult juveniles and hatchlings, and then they will work their way up and become very, very wide. They're a very girthy snake. They'll be an olive or a brown color with nice dark spots going along their back and then lighter spots going around their sides. And then they will have kind of like the ball python of a lighter stripe and a darker stripe, but this stripe typically only starts behind the eyes and does not always go through. The scrub python, this guy has popped up more so in pet trade, so it has only been introduced, but it is not established. And there's very few records, I believe, with these guys. They tend to be 6 or up all the way to 18 feet, but they're very slender. And they have this nice pattern, but it doesn't start on their head. So that's a really easy identification, is that none of their patterns start until past their head. They have this really pretty iridescent kind of reflection, which is unique to them and the next species, the reticulated python. These guys are going to be around 14, 18 feet. They have orange eyes. They are going to have more of a golden body with more yellow and white blotches moving all the way down, and they will have more of that iridescent reflection. So now on to the large lizards that we can potentially find here. This is a Nile monitor. They are established only in certain parts of Florida. I believe it is Hillsborough, Charlotte, and Palm. But they do have a population, I believe, in Homestead as well, but I don't believe it's the entire county of that part of Florida. They will be somewhere between 5 to 6.5 feet, potentially getting up to 7 or 8 feet, depending on the individual. They have an olive or greenish color, sometimes even a black or gray. They have a yellow stripe V pattern, and then little kind of, it's almost like really like a child tried to draw a circle, but very poorly, as kind of the pattern on their underbelly. Something that's really helpful to note with these guys is their tail will be roughly 1.5 times longer than the rest of their body because they are semi-aquatic. So you're almost entirely going to find these guys near major waterways. Argentine, black and white tegu, they are established. They have breeding populations in Miami-Dade, Charlotte, and Hillsborough. These guys are going to be a little bit smaller, around 3 to 4 feet in length. Nice white and black pattern, but if they are a hatchling or a very early on juvenile, they will actually have a green head, which is sometimes hard to notice because as a hatchling, they do kind of look like some other native species. And then they are a long-living lizard species. So essentially that means they'll be somewhere between 15 to 20 years if they live a healthy life of, running through parts of Florida, which is really hard because usually a lot of non-native species here in Florida historically that are lizards don't live that long. They live 2 to 3 years. So it makes the reproduction for these guys really important to monitor and watch because they kind of breed like rabbits. And then the black spiny-tail iguana, this guy is established. It is around 3 to 4 feet. They tend to be black or sometimes a nice dark gray. They have those more enlarged scales around their tail, which is what gives them their spiny tail. They're similar to a Mexican spiny-tail iguana in appearance, but they tend to be a little bit bigger. Usually burrows or climbing is where you'll find these guys, as well as burrowing is a place you'll probably find tegus. And then these guys have already had breeding populations in Dade County, Lee County, and Charlotte County. So native species, kind of the main reason we go through the identification and kind of brief review for a lot of those non-native large reptiles is so we can have the conversation of why this is really harmful to our non-native species, both birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, all of these native species. The way they function here in Florida, specifically the reptiles, is typically as a mesopredator. So it's functioning as both a predator and a prey. So it's kind of doing double duty in an ecosystem. It's adding and taking away from a trophic level in terms of resources. Whereas a lot of these large non-native reptiles, they are added to this equation that is, we'll say, the Everglades, and it's taking a lot of the resources because it's getting to 18 feet and it's just able to eat everything. It's not having a heron coming and eating it at that size. A heron can take it out when it's a hatchling, but that's only a very small period of this animal's life. And that's where we have a lot of these problems because for the most part, snakes and some of these reptiles are really important in controlling pests, whether it's rodents, whether it's insects. And that's very important for stopping the spread of disease, ensuring good crop harvests, and other parts of normal life here in Florida. So some of the native lizard species that are kind of important to note that kind of show you why this is a pretty big problem is, this is a green anole and this is the Florida scrub lizard. They're small. A lot of our native lizards are very small. So when you have a 6-foot lizard that, is essentially in its homeland, one of the apex predators, it's very difficult to expect a lot of these native species to do much about it without our help. Same with a lot of our native snakes. So these are native water snakes. They tend to have sometimes similar patterns to only hatchlings of Burmese pythons or some of these constrictors, but most of them, like I said, they're going to be so small in comparison to some of these large animals that it's really hard to misidentify them. Same with a lot of our native kingsnakes, racers, very beautiful animals. They're really cool, but they're just not going to have the same identification that you're going to find at a lot of those larger constrictors. But you can see based on a lot of these guys' size and colorations that now knowing and now seeing some of those other animals, hopefully you understand a bit more if you were to see some of these individuals, why it would not be a python, why it would not be a common boa constrictor. And then some of the venomous and protected species that maybe if you're out and about and needed some identification help could be helpful. Florida cottonmouth and eastern diamondback. So obviously the rattlesnake's going to have a rattle. These guys do have that band that kind of goes through or goes directly under a lot of the constrictors' eyes. But both of them obviously in size are going to be very small, as well as both of them have defensive behavior that obviously you're going to hear the rattle of the rattlesnake, and then a cottonmouth will actually back up and unhinge its jaw like this and kind of act like he's teasing you, edging you on, wanting you to throw the first punch, we'll say, which is not something a python's going to do. And then really the only large native snake here in Florida is the beautiful eastern indigo. That would be close to some of the constrictor sizes, but obviously it doesn't have that pattern. It instead has a beautiful blue color and then a nice burnt orange as its underbelly. So that's something that could be helpful. And if you do see one of those, you're very lucky. It is a protected species because in some parts of Florida, their populations are not doing too great, but it is absolutely gorgeous. So now we've made it to the quick review of just reporting. Everything. I know I've thrown a whole lot of information at you guys, but don't worry, we will get to questions in just a minute if you guys do have some. So for I've Got One, you can use the smartphone app, you can go on the website, or you can call the hotline. And basically this is just, if you are out there, if you're in these other places and you maybe today feel a little bit more encouraged to join this fight, we'll say, against some of these invasive and non-native amphibians, plants, mammals, fish, whatever, all of that can be reported in this app. I work with in herpetology, so a lot of those animals are more what I am considered well known for in terms of teaching and having these conversations with. But there are a lot of other invasive and non-native animals that definitely you guys reporting through this system is going to help a lot of other research labs, universities, organizations, local governments deal with some of these problems that have came up in the last 20 years. So the hotline number for that is 188 I've Got One. If you were to go into the app, as you can see, there's a whole lot of stuff you guys can go in and to report. This is just showing you that you would use snakes for the species we talked about today, or you would go into lizards and go and report those ones. There are sections in most like subcategories that will say unidentified. This system is processed by different wild biologists in parts of the state. It was actually built using, I believe, it's like University of Georgia, parks, national parks, University of Florida. A whole lot of people came together to build this system that really is going to help with a lot of the removal and a lot of just the information. That's really what this conversation today is about, is getting the information out there so we're able to better manage, better research, and better monitor a lot of what these invasive and non-native animals are doing. So when you go in, you can take a photo of what you saw. It will allow you to note your location. You can put it as a point, or you can actually draw a polygon if you happen to, maybe you were walking and you kind of see it moving across an area and it was a pretty substantial size. If it was a snake, you probably have a good idea that it's some type of unidentified python. You can put that in and then draw that area and it goes into a system. You can say how much time you spent in the area or it spent in the area. If it was in your backyard and you kind of just saw it through the window and you were just curious, you can do that. In most situations, eventually a wild biologist of one of the teams that's attached to this program will come out and try to help remove it. And if it is obviously something maybe more pressing, the hotline is there. So then you would put it in. It's also important that this can be a carcass. This does not have to be a live animal. A lot of the first introductions actually happen and are noted because it was a carcass along the side of the road. And that stuff is all information that the data really could help show us more and more things that we are able to better understand within the context of large non-native species here in Florida. So we are now going to go to questions in just a second. I do want to give a couple resources that maybe will help you continue the conversation we've had today. So the first one is going to be the Florida Wildlife Commission Python training. So if you are curious and actually learning on some of the handling and permitting and contracts needed to do those types of things safely and legally here in the state, this QR code should be able to link you to the resources there. On the third Thursday of every month, they actually do a live training that you can Zoom into, which a lot of people have found very helpful, both in the actual wildlife field and outside of it, to kind of learn and take away some of that information. This is the ASISMA website. So this is going to help you potentially understand a lot more of other invasive species problems that are going on. Maybe you're a gardener and there's some weeds you've seen in your lawn recently. You're not entirely sure what they are. And you go through the I've Got One app and you discovered, oh no, they're not supposed to be here. There's a lot of good resources here that kind of touch on a lot of the work in the state and different parts of the state, not just South Florida. That could be very helpful for better understanding and maybe finding more resources to have more of these conversations. And then this is a Croc Docs website. If you're more curious about the day-to-day work that me and my coworkers do, this will be a great link for you guys to follow. And with that, I would like to thank you guys for sitting through this with me today. And we will start going through some of your questions. All right.
Thank you, Paul. That was really good overview of a lot of information.
It is, yeah.
So
it's a lot of information. I hope everyone could hear me well enough.
Yeah, it was all great. So there's a few questions in the chat. I'm gonna send you a direct chat. I've kind of been compiling them.
Okay.
So that might be easier for you to.
Wow. Oh, okay. There we go.
A few of them may be answered, but you can take a stab at the ones you see them on there.
Mm-hmm. So
we have 15 minutes, so plenty of time.
Okay, cool. Okay, so some of them. All right, so where can we find the maps of kind of these reptile zones? So those are on EdMaps. So that is kind of part of the system for where some of those maps I was showing. I will go back to one real quick while I explain it, which is a part of I've Got One. So these maps that I pulled here, this is something you could go on EdMaps. I believe you just go to the website, it'll allow you to search a lot of different species that you will then be able to understand more of where they're happening in the area. There's a lot more information on some of them than are obviously listed here, but that could be very helpful. Would a boa constrictor breed with a python? Not likely. They are part of the Boidae family, but they are not at the same size of the tree, I believe so. Boas are more similar in terms of that they are, I believe, more related to the Anaconda family rather than directly to the python. So there's not exactly going to be a whole lot of breeding and kind of creating of a super species there. Do constrictors respond to pheromones? I believe some of them do. However, I don't believe tons of that has been done with some of the actual management. A lot of it's more in tracking rather than trying to trap them through pheromones. So that is an interesting concept. I don't know how much research is currently being conducted with that. So which snakes were considered established? So established snakes are going to be ones that are invasive. So in order for an animal to be established, it means it's breeding. If it is breeding, it then is listed as non-native or invasive, depending on how much impact it's having. A lot of the animals, you could argue, simply because they are not from here, they are in some way invasive, because it is likely they are putting pressure in some form or another and out-competing some of our native species. However, a lot of that you have to prove to fully then, say that. But established snakes are going to be Burmese python, the common boa constrictor, and the North African python. And then for for lizards, it's going to be Spinytail iguana, the Nile monitor, the tegu. Green iguana would also be one. You have a whole different types of geckos and anoles and agamas that also are going to be established in different parts. We just didn't go into all of those because some of them are smaller lizard species. And though they do have some impacts, they don't necessarily impact ecosystems in Florida the same way some of these larger species do. Is there a good place online to find basic identification? Yeah, so I've got one. You should be able to go to the website as well as EdMaps. I also believe FWC has a really good resource kind of going down and breaking into categories some of these other non-native and invasive species, where you can go and read up more and see other identification photos, et cetera, to help you better understand some of these species. I know there's a lot of information of what I gave you, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of some of these species that are out there. Are any of the lizard species aggressive, meaning will they tend to bite when threatened? The large ones that we talked about today, yes, absolutely. Like they all got pretty decent jaws. Will all of them immediately tend to bite as like their first line of defense? Probably not. Their first line of defense, most of them will be to run away. But if you were to corner one, then you would probably have problems where one would bite you. They can give you a pretty sizable bite, potentially biting off a whole finger, depending how large the specimen is. Is it legal to kill an invasive species like a tegu if you find one? Same question for juvenile iguana. I don't, off the top of my head, know the correct policy for that. I do know that there is some permitting that is needed for certain actual removals, but that would be something I believe FWC should have linked in that Python resource, as that would go under the trainings that they go over. So you should be able to find a little bit more of that information here within their other. Let's get to a couple more here. Okay. And oh, thank you. You're welcome. That was nice. What is the scientific definition of native? So native is a species. Oh, I remember. This was in the registration. Yeah. So Homo sapiens, are they native or invasive species here in Florida? It's a very interesting conversation because for the most part, invasive / native, the definition starts with basically, like philosophically, it starts when humans first began civilization is when you would start to say native and invasive were like drawn in the sand, those lines. But realistically, yes, humans are technically an invasive species, but only in certain parts, as a lot of our actual distribution over time was kind of just natural. But in many ways, in terms of the amount of impact done to environmental and biological regions, sure. But native and invasive species as like actual terms, an invasive species is going to be something that's non-native, so it's not from here, that is causing harm economically, biologically, ecologically, or in some other format that is really, really negative to the greater ecosystem or from a human health standpoint. While native species are species that have been here, whether there is fossil data, whether there is historical data, and it's typically linked to, I believe, like somewhere in like the 1200s is when like they kind of start building some of a repertoire for some of these species. But a lot of that we're still learning today. There's some tree species, I believe, down in Peru that was thought to be really rare and super historically like important. And then they discovered like 3 years ago that it was actually just a big fancy garden from, I think, some ancient civilization down there, and that this species down there was essentially just an invasive species of plant that took over because they liked it. So it's very a nuanced conversation when we look at it through a historical lens, but for the purposes of today, native is good, has been here, invasive is really harmful, and is new. What is the method for removing agamas and amebas? Okay. Things like that, first make a report, try to potentially get some local researchers or whatnot out there to potentially remove some of them. I'm not entirely sure how toxic they are for your dog or cat. I wouldn't suggest you feeding it to your animal or letting them eat it, but that would be more of a question for vet toxicology. Can we go back to a different link page? Sure. I'll go to this one so you guys can just see the links there at the bottom. Can scout snakes breed? Depends on the project. Some of those are ran through different organizations, so some of them may be breeding, but a lot of the times the point is to have them breed, find out where they're breeding and where those breeding aggregations are happening, and then removing them during that process. So how far along they actually get would have to come down to the local organization or research team that's actually conducting it. But it usually ends up them being removed and more of that turning into other data. Yes, I did not mention green iguanas. They are technically just non-native. Personally, I would put them more as invasive. It goes back and forth on whether or not you believe they are truly herbivorous and not omnivorous, to where they cause more harm, but they tend to cause a lot of harm with a lot of infrastructure stuff, actually. So it kind of depends on who you were to ask. I put them more in line with invasive, but as well as I don't believe they are the most threatening species when it comes to the wildlife within Florida. You know, Nile monitors can potentially, and as well as tegus, can really impact American crocodile and American alligator nests. So if those populations really start to decline, that's way more important to me than, you know, a green iguana digging up someone's garden. It may be really important to you, and if so, like, report it, try to get those stuff removed, work with the local organizations and people in your area. But with the work I do, these are kind of more the stuff that really is becoming a nuisance to the whole state and to a lot of the animals that are really important here.
Paul, we have a few minutes left to keep answering questions. I'm just gonna go ahead and launch just a short poll really quick. So if everyone can just take like 30 seconds and respond to that poll, and Paul can keep answering any questions in there.
Yeah. So for explaining the terms treated and verified, treated means that the animal was removed, whether it was to be used in a different project, whether it's telemetry or a scout snake, or whether it just means it was removed as in taken away and gone through the different protocols for that. A lot of these animals are helpful when they are removed because we're able to use their gut content for treated different studies. So we better understand what native species they're impacting. And then verified means when people took the photos, the wildlife biologist team that goes through all that data, they looked at the photos and were able to verify that that was in fact a correct identification and observation, which then allows us to make sure that we understand where some of these species are coming through. Do agamas have any predators in Florida? Yes, they would have many predators, as they are a smaller lizard species. Different birds, a whole bunch of different snakes would go after them. Potentially even some amphibian species, some large frogs would definitely eat them. Oh, thank you.
People have asked about different maps, and I know that one of the resources online that I really like is actually on the FWC page that I've shared up in the chat. And if you click on if you go to a certain, whichever animal you want to look at, and then click on the risk summary. It gives you kind of a cool, I'll show you guys, I'll post one of them in the link. Gives you kind of a cool like 2-page PDF that has, I think these are pretty current. It looks like up to 2020 data.
Most of them stay pretty active, especially here in the state of Florida with how common this conversation comes up. So that looks, from what I can see, that looks like a pretty good resource. I have it up on my other screen, which is awesome, because all of this, again, is just to help get you guys more involved and just, you know, get the word out there. This isn't always a conversation that's been happening the last 20 years. So we hope the next 20 years having these conversations now will allow a lot less establishment, a lot less introductions, and allow for a more wild native Florida.